OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a short paper called Truth Organizes Values, How Is Defines Ought. And the main idea of this paper is that whatever you believe is rational, responsible, honest, moral, sane, genius, you name it, contributes to justice, contributes to freedom, is good for America, is bad for America, etc., etc. That's all going to be relative to what you believe is true. If I'm like a bird and I'm at the edge of a cliff and I jump off, that's not crazy because birds are creatures of which can fly. Now, a human being, if you jumped off a cliff without a parachute, that might be crazy. For a bird, it would be perfectly normal. If I'm really, really sick and it's true that I'm sick, then it's responsible to go to a doctor. But if I'm not sick, in fact, I'm just, bored, then going to the doctor would not be responsible, it would be a waste of time. And so on and so forth. If a certain government program is actually going to reduce racism in the country, then it would be just to support that program. But if the program were to claim it would have reduced racism and in fact do nothing or maybe even make it worse, then it would actually be bad to support that program, even if I thought that it was good. And this is where it gets really tricky, because what constitutes a value, to use that term, value meaning like, reasonable, just, etc., that's going to be completely relative to what's true. But you see, all of us are locked in interpretation, so it's not easy to figure out what's true. And in fact, determining what's true can be one of the hardest things in the world. But I think very often, maybe because the question of truth is so difficult to determine, we just ask questions like, is it American? Is it just? Is it good? Is it rational? And we kind of skip the question of if it's true, even when we ask if it's rational, because we just define rational according to what we think and don't ask if what we think is true. So we often skip the question of what is true and just ask what is good, but we can't even determine what is good or what is actually good, as opposed to only seeming what's good, unless we know what's true. But again, of course, there's a problem, because what is true is hard to determine. And then adding to the problem is nobody experiences what they think is good or just or moral as being such relative to them, or contingent to what is true. You experience it as kind of like objectively being good. I mean, you don't go out in the world and kind of go, oh, I'm going to support this program because I think it's good. I mean, if you support the program, you're real confident that it's good. And I mean, if someone asks you directly, well, do you know it's good? You may, remember your philosophy class in college and say you don't. But practically, in practicing, you necessarily are going to act as if it, underlined, is true. I mean, as Wittgenstein said, the hinges of the door must be solid for the door to move. I mean, if we didn't act as if what we believed was true objectively, then we wouldn't function. So it's kind of integrated into the problem of being human, that we practically act as if what we believe is objectively true, even though when asked directly, we know that it's subjective. But hey, we can subjectively believe X and X could still be true. Just because we subjectively experience something does not mean that thing is thus not the case. But anyway, the main point is that values are organized by truths. And so we really need to ask and focus on the question, is something true, before we jump into the ethical relation to that thing. Because if we don't, then we could easily commit sort of a Nietzschean transvaluation of values, where we think being honest is actually for a person to lie, or where we think for a person to be a supporter of, say, racial reconciliation is actually for a person to support hurting racial reconciliation, or where we think what constitutes being a patriotic American is actually to hurt America. But of course, that brings us back to, okay, well, so we need to determine what is true. Well, how do we determine what is true? And frankly, a very high number of the papers I've written is on that question, and it's a really hard question. And certainly there are some situations where we can't determine what is true, and then we have to follow a guideline like what's laid out in a scent landing, for example. Assuming I keep that title. But it's a very hard question, but it's really one that we need to give our all, the best we can, before we move on. And I mean, at some point we're going to have to move on and just kind of throw our chips into one understanding of what is true, even though ultimately that might be wrong. I mean, we can't be certain about much. I mean, we can have confidence about a lot of ideas, but we can't necessarily get absolute certainty. So at the end of the day, we're going to have to make some sort of guess, some sort of well-informed guess, but we could be wrong. But we really, really need to try very hard to get it right. Because if we don't, we could end up almost in a Kafka story where we think we're doing something moral when we're doing something immoral, where we think that we're finding an exit when really we're going deeper into the maze of our own self-created problems. So the question of truth is really, really important. And if at the end of the day we have to go, well, we can't determine truth, then at the very least we need to be aware of how serious that problem is as we move forward with our values, so that we don't cling to them so tightly that if new information comes in, we're unwilling to reevaluate them. So anyway, that's the paper, Truth Organizes Values, and thank you for your time.